Hello everyone, I'm Ben Noyen. I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Regulatory Engagement Branch at the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and welcome to our workshop. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which we all meet today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders or the people here with us today. Please note that today's slides are a summary only and should not be taken as law or policy. Today's session consists of three key parts. The first part is on the basics of therapeutic goods regulation. This covers what we do at the TGA and some terms you'll need to know. Part two involves some case studies. We'll put the concepts of part one into practice and work through your responsibilities if you want to supply a therapeutic good. And part three is a Q&A session with our TGA experts, probably the best part of the whole session. This presentation will give you an introduction to TGA's SME Assist service, an overview of therapeutic goods regulation and the role of the TGA, some tips on finding information on the TGA website, and some helpful links for applications. You should have received a copy of the slides via email, but if you haven't, please email us and we'll arrange for you to get those slides. We understand that therapeutic goods regulation can be challenging to navigate. We provide the SME Assist service at TGA to help small and medium enterprises, startups, researchers, and anyone who is new to regulation understand their responsibilities. Our team runs workshops which cover the basics of regulation, market authorisation, manufacturing, advertising, and post-market monitoring. We have recorded and published some of our previous workshops and also have pre-recorded material. You can find all of these on the TGA website under educational videos, on the SME Assist Hub of the TGA website. We also have a range of interactive decision tools to help with decision making, including is my product a therapeutic good and what classification is my medical device, and these are just some examples. We encourage you to subscribe to our SME Assist email list to stay up to date with the latest SME information, including upcoming workshops, new guidance and webinars. Let's start with the basics of therapeutic goods regulation. Our later case studies will provide more detail on market authorisation, manufacturing, advertising and post-market monitoring. When it comes to therapeutic goods, lots of people can be involved. This image represents the different people who might have a role to play. Of course, there are consumers who use the therapeutic goods, but we also have the wholesaler, the retailer, importer and exporters, and manufacturers. And of course, there is the TGA. You could be any of the characters circled in yellow, and of course, you're likely to be a consumer as well. All these people have different responsibilities, and this presentation helps to clarify what these are. So first, we'll have a look at the TGA, who we are and what we do. We are part of the Australian Government Department of Health. We regulate and monitor all therapeutic goods to ensure they are safe and do what they are meant to do. We do this in line with the Therapeutic Goods Act, which provides a uniform national system of controls over therapeutic goods. This benefits both consumers and industry. When going through these slides, please look for the I symbol, which will link you to the relevant page of our website. This link takes you to the Therapeutic Goods Act on this particular slide. So what do we mean by a therapeutic good? It's broadly defined as something used for preventing, diagnosing, curing and alleviating a disease, ailment, defect or injury, such as paracetamol, influencing, inhibiting, or modifying sociology, such as a pacemaker, testing for a disease or ailment, such as an MRI machine, influencing, controlling, or preventing conception, such as a condom, testing for pregnancy, such as pregnancy tests, of course, and replacing or modifying a part of the anatomy, such as a prosthesis. We have decision tools on our SME Assist website to help you determine whether your product is a therapeutic good and the classification for your medical device. Therapeutic goods generally fall under three categories: medicines, biologicals, and medical devices. Let's look at medicines first. Prescription medicines, like antibiotics, require a doctor's prescription. Complementary medicines contain herbs, vitamins, minerals, nutritional supplements, homeopathic, and certain aromatherapy preparations. So examples, of course, are multivitamins, some herbal teas, and essential oils. Over-the-counter medicines can be purchased without a prescription and are not complementary. So examples are lozenges and some cold and flu tablets. Medicines also include vaccines and blood and plasma. The second category is biologicals, which are things made from or containing human cells or tissues, or live animal cells, tissues, or organs. An example is a skin graft between patients. Medical devices have a physical or mechanical effect on the body, or are used to measure or monitor bodily functions, and include instruments like surgical tools, appliances such as pacemakers, and materials like sterile bandages. It's important to know that the TGA doesn't regulate vet medicines, health professionals, health insurance, food standards, and cosmetic and chemical standards. These are regulated by other federal, state, and territory bodies. And please note that cosmetics used in surgery, for example, breast implants and cosmetic injectables, are actually regulated by the TGA. It's also worth noting that we sometimes interact with other regulators. So when you work with us, you may also need to work with others. So what we don't do, we don't research and develop new therapeutic goods. We don't provide clinical advice to individuals. And we don't consider the cost effectiveness or recommend one product over another. And we don't make decisions about subsidies for therapeutic goods. Here we have an overview of the therapeutic goods development life cycle to show you how the different stages fit together. First, you design and get approval to run a clinical trial. Then approve or use your unapproved product in the trial. Following this, you then get approval to supply your product, known as market authorization, and possible subsidization of your product. Here you can see that the TGA is responsible for approving the use of your unapproved product in a clinical trial and approving the supply of your product, shown in the blue boxes. The TGA isn't responsible for designing clinical trials or subsidising therapeutic goods, shown in the green boxes. Subsidisation is carried out by our colleagues in the broader Department of Health. For some products, you may be able to make applications to the Department for subsidy in parallel with your application to the TGA for market authorisation. However, no pharmaceutical, prosthesis, or Medicare listing will occur until the product is included in the Australian Register for Therapeutic Goods. And I refer to that as the ARTG throughout the presentation. For more information, visit the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme website, Prosthesis List Advisory Committee website, or the Medical Services Advisory Committee website. And remember, the TGA approval does not mean that your product will be subsidised. So now let's look at clinical trials in more detail. The clinical trial environment in Australia is quite broad. Clinical trials conducted here are subject to various regulatory controls to ensure that the safety of participants is paramount. All clinical trials require ethics approval before they can commence, and trials that involve the use of unapproved therapeutic goods are also subject to TGA requirements. While the TGA is not heavily involved in clinical trials, our two pathways for accessing unapproved therapeutic goods for experimental purposes are notification process, called the CTN scheme for lower risk products, and an approval process, now called the CTA scheme, for high risk or novel treatments such as gene therapy. This replaces an older previous CTX scheme or exemption scheme, how it was used to be known. Use of unapproved therapeutic goods in a clinical trial must be in accordance with national and international guidelines and the protocol approved by the relevant Human Research Ethics Committee. This table shows various responsibilities under TGA's clinical trial schemes. There is a sponsor who has overall responsibility for the trial. They make a submission to us. They ensure the trial meets requirements, and they're responsible for safety reporting. Then there's the Human Research Ethics Committee, who assess, approve, and monitor the trial. The approving authority is the organisation that gives approval for the trial to be conducted at their site. And then there's the principal investigator, who's personally responsible, supervises the trial, and complies with the requirements, including reporting adverse events in relation to the trial. An Australian Clinical Trial Handbook provides guidance on requirements when conducting clinical trials using unapproved therapeutic goods. It helps those involved to understand their roles and responsibilities under our legislation. For more information on responsibilities outside of TGA requirements, please visit the National Health and Medical Research Council Australian Clinical Trials website. Let's move on to market authorisation or approval to supply your product. Market authorisation has 3 stages. First is the pre-market step, where you compile data and information about your product and include any clinical data you have collected. If you have a low-risk medicine, like a listed complementary medicine, you don't need to provide clinical data with your application. However, you must hold evidence to back up any claims you make about your product and provide it later if we ask. Second is the processing step. You will need to submit your application online and attach the data and information you compile in the pre-market stage. If your application is successful, you move to the third post-market stage, where you have ongoing responsibilities to maintain your market authorisation. Market authorisation is required before you can supply therapeutic good in Australia. Supply means the sale, exchange, gift, lease, loan, hire, or hire purchase of a product. This includes things like a free sample, leasing a dentist drill, and hiring out crutches. All of these things need market authorisation. If you want to manufacture, import, export, or arrange for the import, export, or manufacture of a therapeutic good, you will need to apply for market authorisation. Once you've obtained market authorisation, you're known as the sponsor. The sponsor carries all responsibilities and is financially liable for the therapeutic good. This is the case if there are multiple people working on different stages of manufacture in different countries. And remember, the sponsor has ongoing responsibilities even after approval has been given. Where possible, TGA makes use of assessments from comparable overseas regulators and international assessment bodies in the regulation of medicines and medical devices. This can reduce duplication of effort where an assessment has already been conducted outside of Australia. Criteria and processes differ depending on the type of therapeutic good. And note that TGA is still the decision maker. There are also expedited pathways available for eligible prescription medicines. The priority pathway provides a formal mechanism for faster assessment of vital and life-saving prescription medicines. Provisional approval pathway allows sponsors to apply for time-limited provisional registration, promising new medicines where there is a potential for a substantial benefit to Australian patients. When market authorisation is granted, the product is added to the ARTG, as I mentioned earlier. The ARTG is an online database on the TGA website where you can search using keywords. It's always a good idea to search the ARTG to see similar products that have been supplied. Each ARTG entry is unique in some way, or separate and distinct. This uniqueness depends on the type of therapeutic good you have. Please look at the definition in the legislation that is relevant to your product as shown on the slide. Let's look at a high-risk prescription medicine as an example. If we have another medicine that is exactly the same, but has a different name or different indications or a different dosage, the product is considered separate and distinct and will have its own ARTG entry. But if it has a different pack size, such as a 12-pack of tablets versus a 36-pack of tablets, it isn't considered separate and distinct, and a separate ARTG entry is not required. Here's an example. So sponsorship can happen in lots of different ways. We'll go through this example of a multiple sponsor scenario. Here we have a therapeutic good. Let's say it's a prescription medicine. John from Victoria would like to import a therapeutic good for supply in Australia. So he applies for and obtains market authorisation through the TGA. This therapeutic good, in its exact identical form, can only have one sponsor. Meanwhile, Anna from WA is interested in supplying the same product. She has two options. She can contact John to see if she can be a wholesaler or a retailer of the good. She must get permission from him. There could be commercial agreements in place that may not allow this, and John is under no obligation to have a commercial arrangement with Anna. Alternatively, Anna can choose to sell the medicine under a different brand name, making the product separate and distinct. In this case, she must apply for market authorisation herself. When we're assessing your product for market authorisation approval, we use a benefit versus risk approach. Goods that pose a higher risk of adverse events or are used for more serious diseases like prescription medicines are more tightly regulated than those that pose a lower risk, like herbal supplements. Each therapeutic good will have different degrees of benefit and risk, but in all cases, benefits must outweigh the risks. Let's look at benefit versus risk in the context of medicines. Medicines are considered low or high risk depending on the claims made about the medicine, what it contains, and benefits and risks associated with using it. In Australia, lower risk and high risk medicines are given particular names. Lower risk medicines are called listed medicines. Higher risk medicines known as registered medicines. The ones in between are called assessed listed. Take-home message here is at high risk, registered medicines require more rigorous pre-market authorisation. As this table shows, no prescription medicines are listed. Some over-the-counter medicines are listed, and most complementary medicines are listed. Conversely, all prescription medicines are registered. Most over-the-counter medicines are registered, and some complementary medicines are registered. Examples include some folic acid tablets and some head loss products. In general, if you have a prescription for over-the-counter medicine, you'll need to go through a more rigorous process. On the other hand, if you have a complementary medicine, it's generally less tightly regulated. Similarly, medical devices are classified according to their intended purpose and the level of harm they may pose to users or patients. Classification takes a number of factors into account, including the degree of invasiveness in the human body, the duration and location of use, and whether the device relies on a source of energy rather than the body or gravity. As shown in this table, each class has a particular risk associated with it. Class 1 devices, such as tongue pressors, are low risk, and Class 3 devices, such as heart valves, are considered high risk. It's important for you to understand that our work continues over the lifetime of every therapeutic good, from manufacturing through to adverse events. You should get familiar with the regulatory requirements across the full life cycle for your products. Our regulatory compliance functions support consumer protection and enable a fair market for industry. We monitor and enforce where necessary. Compliance with legislation, regulations, and rules for therapeutic goods. We promote high levels of voluntary compliance through engagement and education as well. Now I'll take you through some general terms and concepts. All the different types of therapeutic goods have their own guidelines, which are updated regularly. These guidelines help with finding out what you need to do when applying for market authorisation and complying with TGA requirements. Please note, they are guidance only, and the relevant part of legislation and regulations is a definitive source of information. Therapeutic goods must also comply with various standards which determine the consistency, product quality, including label quality and labelling standards. Many of these standards are international standards. However, sometimes it is necessary to specify an Australian standard, either for a particular type of therapeutic good or to specify particular labelling, packaging, or other requirements. In these situations, a therapeutic goods order is published. It's particularly useful for you to be familiar with relevant therapeutic goods, orders, and the guidelines. The Australian regulatory guidelines are located under the Industry tab on the TGA website. The different types of therapeutic goods are listed underneath. Select standards and guidelines and you'll find the relevant guidelines there. What you'll also find is a lot of links in the guidelines to various other resources. You can receive regular updates of new guidance materials such as cyber security for medical devices or comparable overseas regulators. I suggest you subscribe to the email list so you get the updates on new guidance, particularly as emerging technologies and the like start to emerge. We start to put regulations over them. TGA Business Service is where you submit and manage your applications. Every sponsor needs an account. You can find the TGA Business Service portal under the About the TGA tab. We recover costs through fees and charges for activities that fall within the scope of the Therapeutic Goods Act. As a sponsor of a therapeutic good, you will be required to pay fees and charges that apply to your goods. Fees are for a service, while charges are an annual tax. All therapeutic goods on the ARTG are subject to annual charges, except export-only products and products that fall under the annual charge exemption scheme. We encourage you to look at the link to fees and charges so you know what to expect. The annual charge exemption, or the ACE scheme, allows for exemption of annual charges for a product or until a product first generates turnover. All new entries on the ARTG are eligible. Sponsors need to make a declaration each year confirming there's a $0 turnover. Note that fees are not included in the ACE scheme, but only charges. Fees and charges are also under the About the TGA tab. It's further on the screen there. Finally, this is how you access the SME Assist service and information about the service on the front page of the TGA website under the heading Industry. And these are our contact details. We look forward to hearing from you. And I'll now hand over to Melanie Leake from our SME Assist team to take you through case studies on market authorisation and manufacturing. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, so the key areas we're going to look at today include market authorisation, manufacturing, advertising, and post-market monitoring. I'll be covering therapeutic goods in general, so look out for these icons on the slides. The icon on the left represents medicines and biologicals. So when you see this icon, the information on the slide relates to both types of products. The icon on the right represents medical devices, and the icon at the bottom means the content relates to all therapeutic goods, being medicines, biologicals, and medical devices. So our first stop in the regulatory maze is market authorisation. So Ben covered the therapeutic goods development life cycle, which includes market authorisation. The sponsors have numerous responsibilities at each stage of the market authorisation process. As mentioned, the pre-market stage is where you compile data information relating to ingredients, manufacturing quality, labelling and packaging. The processing stage is where you submit your online application and the required data and provide more information if requested by TGA. You pay your application fees at this stage and your product is then evaluated or assessed. Post-market stage is where you report adverse events and safety issues or issues with manufacturing or ingredients. You conduct ongoing safety monitoring activities and develop periodic safety reports and risk management plans if applicable. This is where you need to comply with any conditions of registration or inclusion in the ARTG and ensure ongoing fees and charges are paid. Remember that TGA approval does not mean that your product will be subsidised. Apologies. So let's look at what you need to consider in your application, the pre-market and processing stages. Before you apply for market authorisation, you have to determine whether your product is actually a therapeutic good. TGA only regulates therapeutic goods. We don't regulate cosmetics or food. So before you apply for market authorisation, you have to determine whether your product is actually a therapeutic good. TGA, as I said, only regulates therapeutic goods. We don't regulate cosmetics or food, so you need to know what kind of product you have, and you can certainly search the ARTG for similar products. And you can also use our decision tools, is my product a therapeutic good, and others that we have available depending on what type of good you have. For medical devices, for example, you can use the is my product a medical device and what classification is my medical device. You could also ask manufacturers about similar products, and you could also look at the labels and instructions and also advertising material. If you identify your product as a therapeutic good, you can then proceed with the market authorisation process. Please consult the Australian regulatory guidelines that are relevant to your product to determine what's required in the application process. So as you can see on the slide, we have the ARGCM for complementary medicines, the ARGOM or ARGOM as we like to refer to it for over-the-counter medicines, the ARGPM for prescription medicines, ARGB for biologicals, and the ARGMD for medical devices. Note that all the purple and green boxes are links which take you to the relevant guidance. So when you receive your presentation from us, there will be certainly links that you can click on, such as these purple and green boxes, which will take you to those particular guidelines. Again, as Ben mentioned earlier, TGA makes use of overseas assessments where possible. This can reduce duplication of effort where an assessment has already been conducted outside Australia. We may use assessments from comparable overseas regulators and international assessment bodies in the regulation of both medicines and medical devices. The criteria used to identify a comparable overseas regulator and the processes for using overseas assessments will differ depending on the type of therapeutic good you have. The list is always growing, so it's a good idea to check our websites for any updates. Note that at the end of the day, the TGA is still the decision maker and the comparable overseas regulator or international body must meet our defined criteria and our processes. When you're preparing your application for market authorisation, there are two critical areas that you will need to take into consideration. Firstly, what does your product contain? This is mainly relevant to medicines and biologicals, but there are also some medical devices that deliver substances as well. The ingredients contained in your product determine how stringently it is regulated by TGA. Does it contain permissible ingredients, which is a list of ingredients that have been deemed to be of sufficient low risk? Does it contain substances in the poison standard? This is another list of ingredients that could be of much higher risk. Secondly, what claims are you making about your product? Are you intending to make a general claim such as helps promote general health and well-being, or a claim that mentions a specific disease like diabetes? Generally, we'll regulate a product more stringently if it contains higher risk ingredients and makes high level disease specific claims. This means that you'll be required to compile and submit more information to demonstrate efficacy. The relevant Australian regulatory guidelines specify the kind of information that you will need to provide about your ingredients and indications. Therapeutic goods must be clearly labelled to ensure that consumers are given accurate information about your product. For medicines and biologicals, labelling and packaging requirements depend on whether the medicine is prescription, non-prescription, or a biological. These requirements are set out in the labelling orders, which are pieces of legislation. For medical devices, the essential principles specify the labelling requirements and instructions for use for medical devices. The medical devices regulations specify sponsor information that needs to be included with a medical device. The essential principles are the criteria that need to be demonstrated, that need to be met to demonstrate that your medical device is safe for use. When submitting your application, you will need to log into TGA Business Services using your account login details that you'll obtain. For medical devices, you need to submit your manufacturer evidence and get your manufacturer approved before you make an application for market authorisation. Let's take a look at a case study. Here we have Alex, and she would like to become a sponsor for a non-prescription medicine, and it's called Omega Breeze. Let's take a look at what she needs to consider when putting together the medicine label. We're going to look at creating a non-prescription label, and here we would use TGO 92 or Therapeutic Goods Labelling Order number 92. and this is relevant for non-prescription medicines such as your listed complementary medicines. This labelling order will tell us the core information that needs to be on our label, such as the product name, the batch number and expiry date, storage conditions that may be applicable, directions for use, address or contact details for the sponsor. It also specifies how to display the required information. For instance, the required height of the text, the OST-L number must be greater than 1 millimetre. So it's so on this one, for example, it may be too small. As you can see, circled in green, the OST-L number must be greater than 1 millimetre, so it's easily readable. The text must be clearly legible and the label must be durable. Here in our example, the use of the colour behind the active ingredients really make it hard for those ingredients to be seen, and this would be considered a breach. So all of the information that is provided on a label must be clearly legible, and the label must be durable so it remains intact. As you can see on this slide, we have corrected the size of the OST-L number, which makes it clearer, and have also changed the colour of the text, making it much easier to see and read. Our next step is to consider other legislation that may also have an impact on our label. In this example, we will look at the permissible ingredients determination, and we'll start by looking at our krill oil ingredient, which is Euphausia superba oil. We must consider if the ingredient itself has label requirements, and we can do this by looking at the permissible ingredients determination. And this determination can be accessible, is accessible through our website, of course. And there'll be links in this presentation that will take you to it. You can see a snapshot of this determination on the top of the slide here. The determination states that we have to include the warning statement contains crustacean shellfish or derived from seafood. So looking at our label, we have already incorporated the warning contains crustacean shellfish, which we obtained from TGO 92. So when we look at the ingredient in permissible ingredients determination, it will specify what the requirements that apply. This warning is enough to satisfy both TGO 92 and the permissible ingredients determination requirements. We now need to include our indications on the label or what the product will be used for. The use of some indications will require label statements to be included on the label. So let's look at this permitted indication, reduces common cold duration. We need to check the permissible indications determination. So it can get a bit confusing. There's permissible ingredients determination and the permissible indications determination. And we need to check the permissible indications determination to see if there are any requirements associated with the use of reduces common cold duration. Here's a snapshot of the permissible indications entry on the slide. It has a few requirements for the label, including we need to have an if symptoms persist statement and an adults only statement. We'll have to add in those label statements. As you can see, we've added the warning to our main warning section, and we've put the adults only warning up near the directions for use, which will make it compliant. So you can see encircled in the red box here. You can see that you need to consult the relevant labelling order as well as other relevant legislation to ensure that your label is compliant. Note, we haven't covered everything in this example. There is other legislation such as the advertising code that you also need to comply with. We've now reached our next stop, which is manufacturing, and we'll take you through some key elements of this process. So manufacturing is any stage of the production of the good and depends on the type of product that you have, but it can include the following steps: producing, processing, refurbishing, assembling, packaging, labelling, testing and release for supply. There are certain regulatory requirements that must be met when it comes to manufacturing, and we assess the manufacturing processes to make sure they meet certain standards. The standard for assessing medicines and biologicals is called Good Manufacturing Practice, or GMP. The assessment process for medical devices is conformity assessment. Both of these have guidelines and criteria that need to be met to demonstrate compliance. For medicines and biologicals that contain live animal cells, tissues or organs, the criteria is the PICS Guide to GMP. And PICS stands for Pharmaceutical Inspection Scheme, or Pharmaceutical Inspection Convention and Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme. So a nice long one. For biologicals that are derived from human cells, tissues or blood products, it's the Australian Code of Good Manufacturing Practice for human blood and blood components, human tissues and human cellular therapy products. For medical devices, the set of criteria for assessing manufacturing is called the Essential Principles. Manufacturers are required to have a quality management system in place and demonstrate compliance with the essential principles for safety and performance. Conformity assessment uses a risk-based approach so that the higher risk devices are assessed in more detail. Manufacturers that meet the standards are issued with a certification. This is the manufacturing evidence you need to present in your application. For medicines and biologicals, if your manufacturer is located in Australia, then they'll need to obtain a GMP licence from TGA. They have to submit a GMP application to us with details about the manufacturing site. This may also involve an on-site inspection. After the inspection, the manufacturer then forwards the details of their GMP licence to the sponsor. The sponsor is considered responsible for ensuring their manufacturer has a GMP licence. If your manufacturer is located overseas, then it's the sponsor's responsibility to make sure their manufacturer has Gmp clearance, and this is different to a GMP licence. The sponsor submits this manufacturer evidence again as part of their market authorisation application. For medical devices, if a manufacturer can demonstrate that they meet the essential principles for safety and performance that are relevant to the device, they are issued a certificate or they make a declaration of conformity. Note that manufacturer evidence does not need to be submitted as part of an application for a Class 1 export-only device, but it must be available upon request after the product is included in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. For other device types, the sponsor has to submit the manufacturer evidence through TGA Business Services and get approval before submitting an application for market authorisation. So the sequence of events is slightly different for medicines and biologicals compared to devices. For medicines and biologicals, the manufacturer evidence is submitted with the market authorisation application. For devices, you submit the manufacturer evidence first, pay the fee, get approval, and then you submit your market authorisation application. We do have the Good Manufacturing Practice Application Decision Tree on the TGA website that can help you determine what type of application that may be required for GMP or for manufacturing. If your manufacturer is located overseas, you have a few options to obtain GMP clearance or a declaration of conformity. We have various international agreements and arrangements with other countries and jurisdictions, which are called Mutual Recognition Agreements, or MRAs. For medicines and biologicals, there are around 25 different countries that have an MRA or equivalent agreement with Australia, and these include Canada, Singapore, United Kingdom, and numerous European countries. If your manufacturing site is not one of these countries and you're not eligible for MRA, you have to obtain a GMP certification through TGA. This may involve an on-site inspection by one of our GMP inspectors. For devices, we have a mutual recognition agreement with Europe and the UK. MRA certification is issued under Australian law and treated much like TGA certification. We also have comparable overseas regulators or conformity assessment bodies, which include all of the countries and regulatory authorities I mentioned earlier. Applications for inclusion using these may be subject to audit, and audit is mandatory for some high-risk devices. So in essence, we accept manufacturing certification issued by us at TGA, and we also accept certification or other evidence of regulatory approval from some other countries. We regularly inspect manufacturers of therapeutic goods to ensure their compliance. Inspections can happen at any stage during the market authorisation process, and that can range from pre-market through to post-market. Generally, we'll contact the manufacturer informing them that an inspection will be carried out and agree on an inspection date. These inspections might take a day or two. The inspector will identify any deficiencies, if there are any. The manufacturer has to address these deficiencies and provide a response detailing any corrective or preventative actions. The manufacturer must agree to have their site inspected if required. It's the sponsor's responsibility to have an inspection agreement in place with their manufacturer. For our case study, we have Susie, and she wants to be the sponsor of a prescription medicine that is manufactured in Portugal. So because the manufacturer is based overseas, Susie is responsible for obtaining Gmp clearance. Susie's first step is to confirm the following details with her manufacturer. So she needs to confirm if the product is regulated as a medicine in Portugal, and Susie confirms it is. Whether the site has recently been inspected by the Portuguese regulator, and Susie confirms that it has. And if the manufacturer has a GMP equivalent certificate to TGA standards, Susie confirms that they do, and they forward this on to her. Susie then uses the Gmp Clearance Application Assistance tool to check the general evidence requirements for her Gmp Clearance application. The tool will guide her to find out a few more details about her product. She needs to check the Mutual Recognition Agreement list of countries. If a country is not listed, then she can't use that pathway. Mutual recognition is the most straightforward pathway, but you may be able to use other pathways. The tool also asks Susie to check if her type of product can be issued with a Gmp clearance. Gmp clearance can be issued for manufacturers of non-sterile active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs, non-sterile finished products, sterile or biotech APIs, sterile or biotech finished products, and contract testing laboratories. She sees that she can get Gmp clearance for her non-sterile product, which are tablets. There are three possible options for Gmp clearance. The first is mutual recognition agreement, which you could use if your manufacturing site is within the borders of an MRA country and your site has been inspected by that country's regulatory authority. The second is the compliance verification pathway, which you could use if the manufacturer doesn't meet the criteria for MRA and the site has been inspected by an MRA regulatory authority. Then the third is the Gmp Certification Pathway. You could use this if the MRA or CV pathway is not applicable or no acceptable evidence from the recognised regulatory authority is currently available. So for example, if you require a Gmp certificate for your sunscreen, which may not be classed as a medicine in another country. In Susie's case, she can proceed down the MRA pathway because she confirms that Portugal is an MRA country. Her product is regulated as a medicine in Portugal. And the site has recently been inspected by Portugal's regulatory authority and to TGA standards. Note that if Susie's site hadn't been inspected by Portugal's regulatory authority, she would not be able to pick option 3, which involves a TGA inspection. And this is because we have a mutual recognition agreement with Portugal, and we would ask their regulatory authority to perform the inspection on our behalf. We would perform the inspection only if the product was not regulated as a therapeutic good already in Portugal. So to proceed down the MRA pathway, the overseas regulator must meet TGA standards for Gmp codes and have recently inspected the manufacturing site to TGA standards. Evidence must be current, accurate, complete and translated to English if necessary. Note that this refers to the MRA annex on GMP, the sectoral annex on medicinal products, GMP inspection and batch certification. There is also a separate MRA sectoral annex on medical devices. Now, Susie submits her Gmp clearance application through TGA Business Services. So she logs in, selecting clearance application, provides the required details, pays the associated fees, and agrees to the declaration. Susie's now submitted her Gmp clearance application successfully. And that brings us to the end of our manufacturing case study. So I'll now hand you over to Stephen, who will take you through advertising and post-market monitoring. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. So now that the goods are on the market, we're going to take a look at advertising and what that entails. So advertising requirements apply to all therapeutic goods. It doesn't matter if it's a medical device or a complementary medicine. Some medicines, such as prescription medicines and biologicals, do have requirements that mean they can't be advertised to consumers. So what is advertising? Advertising is considered as any promotional material. It includes, but isn't limited to, labels on your medicine, which includes packaging, your TV advertisements, websites, and social media sites. Advertising is regulated by the Therapeutic Goods Act of 1989, the Therapeutic Goods Regulation, and the Therapeutic Goods Advertising Code. Advertising is your responsibility, and the Advertising Code applies to all therapeutic goods to varying degrees. The Advertising Code outlines key requirements that must be met when advertising to the public. So it's important that you familiarise yourself with this piece of legislation and understand what you can and cannot do when it comes to advertising. Make sure you're aware of what your labels, any advertisement says. Make sure that you're not being misleading. You ask yourself, do you hold evidence that your product can work the way that you're suggesting? It's important not to wait until a complaint comes through to the TGA from the public, or we audit you for a complaint. You can make any changes at any time to correct mistakes. We do have guidance to help you understand the code, the requirements, and you can also contact the TGA if you need. Many of the rules for advertising are contained in the Advertising Code. The code regulates what can and can't be said when advertising therapeutic goods. It's broken down into sections, with some of the key sections highlighted here on the slide. As mentioned, we do have specific code guidance to help advertisers interpret the Advertising Code, and we suggest that you read this in conjunction with the code. You can find this guidance on the Advertising Hub on the TGA website. So you can find the Advertising Hub, as I said, on the TGA website. This is a one-stop shop for all information relating to advertising. It contains guidance and educational materials, as well as information around complaints. You can also submit an advertising inquiry through the hub, and you can also contact the TGA if you're unsure of any requirements or you're having any difficulties interpreting the code at all. So we regulate advertising because not only can a false claim be misleading, when it comes to therapeutic goods, it can also be unsafe. Advertising must not be socially irresponsible or mislead or deceive the consumer. You can see here some examples showing how bad advertising can be dangerous to the consumer. Now we'll have a look at a case study. This is Dan. He's got a listed complementary medicine called Beans Tonic. We'll have a look now at what he shouldn't do when advertising on his label. Although this is a medicine label, the breaches shown would apply to any advertising material. So be that a TV ad, magazine articles, social media posts and anything like that, for any therapeutic good that's allowed to be advertised to the public. Here are the breaches and we'll just run through them now. So the advertising code gives information about endorsements. Your advertisement can't be endorsed either directly or implied by certain factions such as the government, government organisations or health professionals. In this example, old Dr. Seuss is representing a health professional. He's saying that he loves beans. Now we might question if this is really his supporting or endorsement of the product. However, because the name of the product is about beans, so beans tonic, this is taken to be an indirect endorsement of the goods, and we would consider this one a breach. So graphics and images are not immune to advertising either. The government logo here is enough to be a breach as it implies government endorsement. Just remember, just because your goods are being supplied on the market and may have been reviewed post-market or gone through the pre-market assessment, this does not mean that the TGA endorses your product. So this would be a breach too. You may not reference serious forms of diseases, ailments, or conditions unless you have prior approval. We call these restricted representations. In our example here, they don't have prior approval. So using this restricted representation is also a breach. A restricted representation is defined in the legislation, but generally they're serious forms of diseases, conditions or ailments that ought to be diagnosed and managed by a health professional. So this indication regarding diabetes is also a breach, as diabetes is a restricted representation. The last breach here relates to the diabetes indication again. So you can't advertise an indication if it's not present on your ARTG entry. This indication wouldn't be allowed on the ARTG entry because it does contain that restricted representation, unless of course it did have prior approval for that. So this would be another breach here. While there are advertising restrictions that apply to therapeutic goods, such as the prohibition on advertising prescription medicines to consumers, there may be circumstances in which advertising of these may be permitted. Authorisations are only given in exceptional circumstances. So in the event of, in the interest, of public health, in 2019, the TGA authorised advertisements for vaccines that are or form part of a Commonwealth or state or territory campaign. This vaccines exemption is sufficiently broad to capture the Australian government's COVID-19 vaccine campaign and corresponding state and territory campaigns. Under the exemption, third parties are permitted to use only Australian government or state or territory government authorised materials to promote the use of COVID-19 vaccines. The TGA published a fact sheet to assist providers to disseminate consistent, accurate and contemporary information around COVID-19 vaccines without breaching the Therapeutic Goods Act. So here's a second case study looking at advertising and social media. This is Daphne. She is the sponsor of a device called a TENS machine, and her device is called the TENS Best. She has a Facebook page to help her promote her product. Here's a snapshot of Daphne's Facebook account and her most recent post. So do remember that social media platforms and social media posts do count as advertising. So the claims in the advertisement are quite low level. They don't seem to be exaggerated and are responsible in terms of not encouraging people to delay medical treatment or ceasing a prescribed pain management strategy. The photo is of a generally healthy individual and all applicable warnings are present. So where's the breach? Let's take a closer look at some of the comments made by strangers. Comments in a social media post are considered testimonials, and it's up to you, and you as the sponsor are responsible for ensuring that any testimonials comply with requirements. An example is that comments must illustrate typical cases, and they have to comply, with all the other advertising requirements. So they can't be misleading, for example. So Mr. Bikeman here is making a simple statement that doesn't reflect on the product's capabilities. So this is fine. Anna's also fine. She's making some reasonable statements about how she feels about the product and how it helps her. Then we get to Simon. Oh, Simon. He has started to see his bones getting thicker and stronger. And he's saying that his product is going to be great and will prevent with rheumatoid arthritis. This kind of statement isn't what we would consider typical of the results to be expected from the use of this TENS machine. It's also not a typical case. So a typical case would be more along the lines of what Anna's said here about providing some general pain relief. This comment also mentions a restricted representation being rheumatoid arthritis. The product has made no reference to or claim to help with arthritis in any form. Now, Daphne herself has not made any errors, but Simon has, and it's the sponsor's responsibility to ensure that all testimonials adhere to the code. What can you do? Moderate your posts and delete any comments that are non-compliant. Keep the positive and accurate testimonials once you're satisfied they comply with the code, but just make sure that you remove any that are likely to land you in trouble. So testimonials must be from verified users, illustrate typical cases, and of course comply with all other requirements. Now let's move on to post-market monitoring. What does this mean? So post-market monitoring is the continued upkeep, if you like, of your therapeutic goods once on the market. As a sponsor, you're responsible for ensuring that your goods remain compliant and reporting back any problems. Once your product is on the market, there are a few things that you need to consider as a part of the post-market monitoring process and things that you'll need to mandatorily report back to the TGA. So you must collect all adverse events. The term adverse events used here is quite broad. It encompasses many different types of adverse events, such as reactions, which I'll explain in more detail shortly. For medicines only, we also have a deficiencies or defects and medicine shortages. So these have mandatory reporting requirements, which I'll also explain in more detail shortly. For devices, in addition to adverse events, reporting is also required for overseas regulatory action and the results of investigations undertaken by the manufacturer, such as further clinical studies and reviews of adverse events. Now, let's go through the basics of an adverse event for both medicines and medical devices. Reporting an adverse event to the TGA helps us to understand current issues and prevent further issues with the therapeutic good. Medicines and medical devices have different pathways when reporting an adverse event, but the concepts behind them are similar. For medicines, the term for capturing adverse events is pharmacovigilance, and serious adverse reaction reports are received by the pharmacovigilance team here at the TGA. Medical devices included as part of their post-market vigilance. So adverse event reports go to the device's post-market monitoring team. For medicine sponsors, it's mandatory that you notify the TGA of your Australian pharmacovigilance contact person within 15 calendar days of your first ARTG entry. We want you to establish and manage a pharmacovigilance system which will help to collect, record, and assess serious adverse event reports. And we need to know who to contact in the case of an unexpected event. You may be subject to pharmacovigilance inspections, which will examine your compliance with the applicable Australian pharmacovigilance legislation and guidelines, of course. So investigations are typically focused on unusual or potentially serious problems, or problems that have high levels of incidence. Both pharmacovigilance and medical devices can request information from you to audit and ensure compliance. Do note that the TGA's request for information is a legal request under the Act and has strict timeframes that you must adhere to. So the biovigilance team is who you report to if you're supplying a biological. Now, we do perform audits of medical devices to make sure that you are compliant with the essential principles also. Reviews can be done following an adverse event or when we conduct a post-market review on a kind of device. Medical devices do not require you to delegate a particular person for adverse events. but keep your contact details in the TGA business services up to date. So do consider using a general email so the email's not missed if someone is away or leaves your business. Now, the devices post-market monitoring team may go out to on inspection, in the future, but at this stage, that team currently do not conduct inspections. Now, two main concepts are shared when it comes to reporting. You need to collect reports of all incidents, big and small, from the reporting person, and make sure that you do keep all of your records. With medicines, always record the 4 main points of information for you from your reporter for every report. For medical devices, the adverse event reporting form prompts you to collect more information from the affected user and the manufacturer. So best practice here is to collect as much information as possible. Terminology of an adverse event is important because it defines what the event is. It determines whether it's mandatory to report it and how long you have to report it to the TGA. If you're unsure of the severity of an adverse event, treat it as serious and report it just to be safe. Now, the pharmacovigilance area have 4 main terminologies, and it's important that we go through the definitions of each one today. So number 1, I've mentioned a few times, is an adverse event. This is any untoward medical occurrence of a patient, consumer, or clinical investigation, which may not have a causal association with the medicine. So for example, we could be looking at an abnormal laboratory finding. An adverse drug reaction is a noxious or unintended response to a medicine, a reasonable possibility that the medicine caused the adverse event. Next, number 3, we do have a serious adverse drug reaction. Any adverse drug reaction that results in death, is life-threatening, requires or prolongs hospitalization, results in significant disability or incapacity, or is a congenital abnormality. Now, number 4, we do have a significant safety issue. So this would be a new safety issue or validated signal considered by you that requires urgent attention of the TGA. Now, an example here could be finding out that a raw material used in your medicine was suddenly deemed not as safe as first thought. Now, you must still collect all reports for any type, but these last 2 are mandatory for you to report to the TGA. So that would be the serious adverse drug reaction and significant safety issue. Now, we might just move on here and have a look at some medical device terminology. They do have 3 main categories. So number 1 would be an adverse event. That's an event that led to death, a serious injury, or serious deterioration to a patient, user, or other person. So as you can see, this is quite different to the medicines terminology. The next we'll have a look at is a near adverse event, which is an event that may have led to death or serious injury. Number 3, a serious public health threat or concern. So this would be a hazardous event arising from systemic failure of a device, usually coming from an adverse event or near adverse event itself. Typically, it'd be something that the TGA must act on swiftly to avoid public health, to ensure public health safety. Now, all of these terms that we've discussed there around medical devices are mandatory for you to report to the TGA. Now, timeframes will vary depending on the type of event. Timeframes are strict and are in calendar days. So this means that public holidays and weekends are not exempt. It's important that you read relevant guidance material to understand the required timeframes, which you can find in the information links that we've provided. As an example, a significant safety issue for medicines need to be reported within 72 hours, and serious public health threats or concerns for devices need to be reported within 2 calendar days. Now, how do you report? Again, this differs for medicines and medical devices. For medicines, there are three main ways to report a serious adverse drug reaction. That'd be through TGA Business Services, online on the form available on the TGA website, or via email. Significant safety issues are reported through email. Now, medical devices do have an online form available through your TGA Business Services account for all reports. Finally, there are two other mandatory reporting responsibilities to remember. So these apply to medicines. First of all, a medicine deficiency or defect needs to be reported to the TGA. We do expect you to monitor the manufacture, storage and handling of your medicines and report any deficiencies or defects that you find, even if it's just in a single batch. The medicine shortages mandatory reporting scheme only applies to prescription and some over-the-counter medicines. For these medicines, it's mandatory. This is a mandatory reporting scheme, which helps the TGA monitor shortages of critical medicines, making sure that Australia doesn't run out of, potentially life-saving medicines. However, any medicine can report a shortage. So it's available to you and voluntary if you're not supplying a prescription or specific over-the-counter medicine. So you can still report any shortages. So this brings me to the final case study that we'll look at today. So here we have Daphne and a TENS machine again. Hello, Daphne. We'll look at how she reports an adverse event. So what do you do if somebody reports to you that they've been injured by a medical device? Daphne receives an email from an affected user who claims that they've hurt themselves using her TENS machine. Although Daphne is somewhat skeptical that anyone could harm themselves using a device, this user claimed that they strained their wrist using it. Ignoring the email is not best practice, of course. So Daphne needs to report this incident to the TGA as an adverse event. She goes to the TGA website and finds more information on adverse event reporting for medical devices. Her first step is to consider what type of event she's dealing with, as medical devices have both adverse events and near adverse events, as we discussed earlier. So these can be associated, caused by, or partially attributed to the use or misuse of a device. And an event involving a medical device does not have to involve a patient or user. This doesn't exclude it from being reported. Now, an adverse event is an incident that results in serious injury, illness, or death to a patient, healthcare professional, or any other person, as we discussed earlier. A near adverse event is similar, except that it could have resulted in serious injury. Daphne's a little confused at this point. The complaint doesn't seem very serious, and she wonders how someone could strain their wrist using a TENS machine. Daphne talks to her colleague Susie, who advises her if she's unsure, she should report it. The act of reporting is not an admission of the manufacturer, the sponsor, user, or patient liability for the event or its consequences. An adverse event does not necessarily mean that something is wrong with the product. So again, as we said earlier, if you're unsure, report it. Although Daphne does not know the extent of the wrist strain, what if it turned out to be quite serious? Maybe a skin burn. Susie tells Daphne that there are expected reporting timeframes for adverse events, and she'll need to make sure that she follows those. Now, by following the TGA's guidelines on our website, they do determine that Daphne has 30 calendar days to report this incident, and will also have to inform her manufacturer. So the website prompts Daphne to collect information from the affected user. There are minimum details that she'll need, and those include details about herself as the reporter, details about the affected user, referred to as the patient, details on the product involved, and of course the incident itself. Daphne gets back in contact with the affected user, as I said earlier, called the patient, and gathers all the information from this person. Daphne now has to report this information to the TGA. So she learns that the online form for reporting is actually in her TGA Business Services account, and the report's done through that account. So she refers to the TGA's guidance material on how to submit a report through the medical devices incident reporting system. Now, using the step-by-step guide, she hits submit and successfully creates a new report of this incident. The report is the initial report. She doesn't have all the information that's required to make it a final report at this stage. So at this point, Daphne receives a DIR number, which is the device incident report number, which is created when she submits this initial report. So she needs to keep this DIR reference number, as she'll need it in the future. This isn't the end of Daphne's adverse event reporting though. So within the initial report, as she's filling it out, Daphne is prompted to seek more information. She now needs to check her own information and report this to the TGA. So she needs to assess her own quality management system, or QMS, and or her surveillance practices in supplying her TENS machine. She'll also need to check that she hasn't received a similar complaint about her device in the past, and overseas too, if she supplies overseas, of course. Now she needs to log back into her TGA Business Services account. She needs to update that initial report, and she'll do this using the DIR number that she was given initially. So after providing that information and again hitting submit, her initial report then becomes the final report. Once the TGA receives her final report, we will typically contact a sponsor within 3 to 4 business days. This is done through email, and the email will typically contain further questions about the report for the sponsor to answer. We may want to know the current supply numbers of the device or request a copy of the instructions for use, and we may ask for the sponsor's analysis at this point too. So when we reach out, Daphne answers all the questions we've asked her. And it turns out that the TGA have received numerous reports about wrist strain from the improper use of TENS machines. Although no one had previously struggled with Daphne's device, the TGA held a much bigger picture in view, which again is why it's really important to report these sorts of issues. Now, the TGA informs Daphne that because of a growing number of misuse cases, will require her to update information in her instructions for use sheet. So she'll need to include the warning, do not use on wrists, or words to that effect. So that brings us to the end of the case studies. I do hope that makes your navigation of therapeutic goods regulation somewhat clearer. Now, just before we do go to a short break, we were hoping to be presenting this workshop today from Brisbane, but of course, due to the flooding up north, we've had to move to an online-only event. So we just wanted to let everybody know that all the staff here at the TGA are thinking of everybody across Queensland and New South Wales that are affected by the flooding at the moment. And we do wish you and your loved ones the safety in this difficult time, and sincerest apologies and sympathy.